hoping we have the time, or we hope they have the right time. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, good afternoon. My name is Don Dew. I'm the Executive Director of the Nebraska Statewide Independent Living Council. And today is our monthly educational series. This month, we're talking about restraints and seclusion. And I'm just here to actually talk about a little bit of housekeeping. But first, I want to tell you about Melanie Davis, who is going to be working in the background. She is going to be working with some questions and answers, putting stuff in the chat box. She's going to be doing a lot of just background things that you won't necessarily know, but she is an integral part of this process. She is from the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. And I also want to say that these sessions are actually part of the Nebraska Disability Advocate. There's 22 different disability organizations that work together, figure out what the topics will be, who the facilitators will be, and then who's going to actually present. So we're really, really lucky to be able to have such good presenters every month. Now, as far as the housekeeping, it kind of depends on what type of device you have, where your toolbar will be. It can be on the top or the bottom of your screen. Melanie is going to put in the Dropbox some keystrokes for Zoom, which makes that easier for you. We do have 2 sign language interpreters that are available. They'll be spotlighted, and you can pin them if you want, so they're easier and always available for you. We do have a captioner, and we have closed captioning. You can hit the CC button, and you will be able to see the closed caption. Also, all sessions besides being closed caption are recorded, so we will have those on the Nebraska Silk website. The last thing that I want to tell you is please use the question and answer button if you have, which is the Q&A button, if you have questions. That'll keep the chat area free for talking or doing other questions, but the main questions for the presenters should be in the Q&A. That will free that up for the presenters to be able to know who to answer in the end. So I'm going to get off here so I can let you listen to the presentation. I'm going to hand this over to Mark Smith. He's going to present, he's going to tell you who the presenters are. He's moderating today, which we're very happy about. So I will hand this over to you, Mark. I'm glad you're here.
Thanks, Don. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, because I've been hanging around for a while, so some of you I know do know me, but irrespective, my name is Mark Smith. I'm on the faculty of the University of Nebraska Medical Center's Monroe-Meyer Institute. Along with Melanie, I work for the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities grant program here, which is a program that has several core functions: training, research, information dissemination, services, etc. And we're happy participants in the disability education series. We were kind of on the ground floor when this all started with our celebration of the anniversary of the ADA quite some months ago now. And, you know, we continue to have great topics, great presenters, and we think it's a real service to the state. So I hope you're able to gain a lot from this discussion. I know that I plan to. What brings us together today? I'm going to quickly put up the agenda. I'll share that screen, and you should be able to see that pretty well. Of course, Don just spoke. I'm just going to kind of start us off. Our presenters for today are Edison McDonald, who's the Executive Director of the ARC of Nebraska. Also, Mary Angus, who also works at the Monroe Meyer Institute and has a wide and varied uh, series of experiences working within the disability space, and has significant um, experience as relates to restraint and seclusion issues. And then finally, Brad Mearens, who is the Public Policy Director for Disability Rights Nebraska, the Protection and Advocacy Association for the state of Nebraska. I might mention that along with Disability Rights, the Monroe Meyer Institute, one of our other federal partners, federal program partners in the state of Nebraska is the Developmental Disabilities Council. I'm sure I didn't say that quite right, but I hope you catch my meaning. Anyway, every state has a university center, a protection and advocacy organization, and a developmental disabilities council. And some states have more than one university center due to population. But what brings us together today is the discussion around restraint and seclusion. As I'm sure many of you are aware, these refer to a broad series of interventions that are utilized to respond to certain kinds of behavior problems, behavior issues. When we talk about working in the disabilities arena, we're talking about individuals with disabilities who exhibit behaviors that are significantly dangerous or destructive. Why is it an issue? It's an issue because first and foremost, if these are utilized, when these are utilized, there are just a series of issues and concerns that come to the fore immediately. I've actually worked for literally decades in programs where I encountered circumstances where staff persons or teachers or family members were utilizing physical restraint. That is literally restricting someone's movements physically, or seclusion, where the person is secluded, and isolated away from other people, and worked a lot to introduce treatment. Because when we talk about restraint and seclusion, we're really not talking about something that really serves as a treatment function in as far as addressing either some kind of behavioral concern on the part of an individual or some kind of activity or behavior related to a mental health diagnosis and so forth. So again, when restraint and seclusion in and of themselves are not one thing, that tends to refer to a series of potential interventions. And they tend to be they're the point where things have kind of fallen down. And one thing I want to assure the folks that are listening in today is that I think I share this with my other presenters, the other folks you'll be hearing from. We are not anti or pro anything other than ensuring that people are safe, ensuring that our caregivers, in whatever role they're in, have the resources, support, and training to utilize, ideally, the least possibly restrictive procedure, excuse me, in terms of addressing problem behavior or symptoms of mental health diagnoses with persons with disabilities. We're really talking about this, I should add that we're talking about this in terms of persons that have a diagnosed disability co-occurring with some kind of behavioral disorder or some type of mental health illness. So I'll talk about that a little bit more later in terms of some of my experiences and some of my concerns and some of my thoughts about my experience with this. But before I do that, we have some other speakers that are going to step up and share some critical information about what are we talking about specifically when we say restraint and or seclusion, and what's going on in the United States and our state as it relates to the use of these procedures. Um, I just one last point of emphasis: when someone is restrained or someone is secluded, we usually are at a point where we're using very restrictive approaches. And we're not using necessarily therapeutic approaches. So I think that's a critical piece to keep in mind as we move forward. Typically, if someone is in restraint or if someone is secluded, everything else that has been tried has been shown to not have worked. Ideally, active treatment is going on. In many cases, for me, it wasn't, and these procedures were being used. Again, I'll talk about that some more later in our discussion. But first, I'd like to introduce Mr. Edison McDonald, the director of the ARC of Nebraska. The ARC has very stringent rules and policies regarding the use of behavioral interventions. And so I know this is an area of interest for him and for the ARC in general. So Edison, if I can hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark.
I'll stop sharing at this point.
Okay. As Mark said, my role is as the executive director of the ARC of Nebraska. We have 9 chapters and over 1,500 members across the state who we work with. And we really get involved because we hear so much from our members, from families on the ground who have a child who has been restrained. This happens all the time in Nebraska. And while there are supposed to be some protections, they're honestly not enough. And, you know, I always like to make sure that we center ourselves in those stories, in those experiences. Probably one of the ones that stuck with me the most is of a kid who came home with finger marks that you could see. And I was sent some of these pictures and you could see the finger marks on their arm, on their neck. And how they had been physically restrained. And normally we would consider that assault in our general community. She took them to the police and the police did nothing. That's ridiculous. That's what we are dealing with. Unfortunately, Nebraska has had a mentality, especially coming from one senator, that we need to go and loosen our statutes and laws to ensure that more people can restrain kids, even though every other state in the nation is really heading the other way. And even at the federal level, we have legislation going and trying to make sure that we will be more protective and really work on limiting this further. So I just want to talk a little bit about overall the data and kind of what this looks like, and why this is especially important for people with disabilities. Restraint and seclusion is used 40.4% of the time on students with autism. 2.3% of the time it's on students with a learning disability. 2% of the time it's on students with a speech or language impairment. And 1.8% of the time on a student with another type of intellectual disability. The non-disabled categories include 28.3% on a student with an emotional disturbance, 16.8% on a student with another health impairment, 7.6% on other, and 1.2% on what's called consent to evaluate. But the largest chunk is undoubtedly on students with disabilities and different types of disabilities. This has also been shown to be a costly move. There's one study in particular on Grafton Integrated Health Network, and over a 12-year period, they went and took their usage of restraint and decreased it by 99% until the point it was basically eliminated. And so this entity that serves 3,200 people with intellectual, developmental, and psychiatric disabilities was able to go and make this happen in a facility with a huge range of needs. The same time, the provider saw a 64% decline in client-induced staff injury and an estimated fiscal savings of $16 million in associated costs from overtime, turnover, and workers' compensation. Meanwhile, clients were far more likely to achieve mastery in their goals. So this is a financial choice. This is also a choice that makes sure that we're really focusing more on the quality of life for individuals. The civil rights data collection indicates further that schools restrain students with disabilities at a higher rate than students without disabilities. So I talked about kind of what those numbers look like overall, but when comparing, we also need to think about what's the difference between the kind of two key pieces of do we have of how many students have disabilities. So there's about 12% of students who are enrolled in public schools nationally who have a disability, but 67% of the students who were subjected to restraint or seclusion in school were kids with disabilities. So it's a huge imbalance. Next, I want to talk about relying on restraint or physical force can result in physical injury or even death for students. I know we've seen some kind of horror stories, but overwhelmingly, this happens to students with disabilities. And we need to make sure that we're really keeping that in mind. And really, Nebraska needs to be thinking about how do we move forward. In the past, I think folks have pointed out, and especially senators in the discussions around some of the negative legislation that we've seen, like LB 147, that the bill they've drafted really isn't in line with any sort of educational training, in line with the research, in line with thoughts. We've just basically said, no, we just want to do this. We just want to be able to go and grab kids without a thought process, without the checks and balances. On the other hand, within our state statute, we have disability service providers that do have clear and quality standards that are far more based in the research. So really making sure that we're thinking through how we're dealing with this is so important, and making sure that if it is ever used, it's as a last resort after you've tried less restrictive sort of settings, and you've tried to figure out, making sure that you've got training like the MANT system to be able to really think through a comprehensive, integrated approach that focuses on preventing, de-escalating, and then if necessary, as a last resort, intervening if an individual poses a threat of harm to themselves or to others. These types of trainings, and there are a couple of them, focus on building healthy relationships between stakeholders in human service settings instead of focusing on the negative power dynamic mentality. This isn't about challenge. This isn't about conflict. It's all about building relationships and trust and ensuring that we are de-escalating whenever possible. The next piece I wanted to talk about is, I think this is really just seen as violent behavior, but frequently it's not. This isn't about violence. This is about frustration. This is about anger. This is about confusion. And that's when we see these instances happen. I think, about the times I get really frustrated or I'm confused about what's going on, the likelihood that I'm going to comply is going to significantly decrease. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about? So I think it's also important to think about really how do we approach this at its base? How do we ensure that we're really thinking through the ethics of this, and really shifting away again from that negative power dynamic instead, and focusing on how do we build up positive relationships, and then how do we help to mitigate unpredictable or unexpected behavior and ensure that we're really kind of working together. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit more about, kind of some of the concerns that we've seen, especially within some of the proposals that we've seen in the past. We've really worked on figuring out how to mitigate this. Unfortunately, most of the bills have not come anywhere close to where we need to be. But some of the important conditions are thinking through how do we make sure that we're really following a kid's IEP or 504 plans, which is just super hard to be able to actually implement. How do we ensure that we have staff who are actually trained and know about how to use these trainings, know about de-escalation and are focused on that first. And then if they have to, that they have a quality training process to really think through. Then reporting and data. Brad will talk about a little bit of data, but I think one of the biggest things we're really frustrated with is the lack of data in Nebraska. So we focus a lot more on a lot of national data, but better understanding kind of what those issues are. And then diving into, kind of what sort of definition determines the reasonable or appropriate nature of these types of methods of using restraint or seclusion. And so some of the things we're really concerned with is they use language like destruction of school property. Well, destruction of school property could mean something as simple as snapping a pencil or a crayon or tearing up a piece of paper. Instead, we want to focus on making sure that this is really life-endangering sort of behavior if you ever get to that point. Then some of the other things we always want to think about that's really important is thinking about the time of usage. How long you use restraint can have a huge impact in terms of how that affects individuals. Thinking about certain types of restraint, especially prone restraint, so where you're on the ground face laying down, pain-inducing and mechanical restraints. Thinking about setting time limits about how long it can be used. I think this is always something that we've seen that has been frustrating of just when most of the harm comes, it tends to be those longer usages of restraints. And then working on some of those reporting requirements so that we know what happened. So parents and administrators and if necessary, police can know what was used, and so they can actually analyze if it was fair or not. And then thinking about terminology. Again, a lot of this is just the wrong mindset. We've talked a lot in the past about shifting from physical restraint to physical intervention. And the piece there, we've had some bills that have changed that, but they haven't changed the underlying mentality. They'll say instead, okay, we're going to talk about a physical intervention instead, but it's not actually changing the underlying intent. I think overall, though, we really need to be thinking also and having in the back of our mind always here in Nebraska that we are always under the threat of federal litigation on this issue, because this is ultimately about the rights of individuals and children with disabilities and making sure that we are really trying to protect folks, make sure that they feel safe going to schools, making sure that they feel safe in their community and are able to learn. And then the last thing I wanted to say, and I'll wrap up, is I want to make sure for anyone who does encounter issues with restraint, please feel free to reach out to the ARC, or we have chapters across the state. If you have concerns about, what this looks like in your IEP, we have advocates out there and chapter staff on the ground who are willing to go to IEPs with you and help you to think through how to really focus on mitigating this as much as possible, and help to address these issues. And if there are other questions or issues you're encountering, the most important thing that you can do is help to give us information. The more that we know, that we hear of what's going on, the more stories that we have collected, the more we're able to go and advocate for better practices. That I'll hand it back to Mark. Oh, you're on mute, Mark.
I was trying to unmute and I was showing my technological naivete. So thank you, Edison. Very, very informative. At this point, I want to segue a little bit and talk a little bit more about the kind of maybe the personal perspective from the professional as well as the individual side. I really appreciate Edison's kind of kicking us off. I think he really touched on a number of not only the broader sweep of data and information, which can at times feel a little overwhelming, but you know, this is what's going on out there in settings where people with disabilities are being served. And so I think, you know, it's a matter of naming and claiming the problem and not just, you know, saying, well, wow, this is just too much. For the benefit of the group online, my training is in school psychology. And so for a lot of my career, I worked as a school psychologist, but I also had the opportunity to work in settings where people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were being served, working with children and families, working in private clinics, working in a number of settings. And it's kind of, when we talk about mental health and mental health treatment, it's kind of a niche area. The one thing I want to say first is we probably have not distinguished ourselves as a state in terms of serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities who have co-occurring behavior or mental health diagnoses. There have been efforts, significant efforts, but I would say to this point, we're probably not where we need to be in terms of serving this group of individuals who typically tend to be very resource intensive. There are two groups within developmental disability services in terms of resource intensity, and one is are folks with that have medical conditions and you know require special treatment within their settings where they're being served. But the other is people who have behavior problems or have mental health issues. They can be quite resource intense. And in terms of my experience as a clinician, I started in this field many years ago. You know, if you slip me a 5, I'll tell you how many, but other than that, I'll just say I have some experience. And one of the things that I encountered very early on was circumstances where staff were frustrated to the point that they were using significant levels of restraint. I was running into people that were in seclusion rooms all day long. I was also running into situations where individuals were being groomed for placement back into highly congregate settings like the intermediate care facilities or institutional settings, regional centers, because their behavior was so egregious and difficult to manage, managing at least in terms of the person's safety and others' safety around them. And one thing that I tried to step in to do immediately was introduce more thoughtful treatment. We have technology that is quite powerful when it comes to dealing with folks that have these kinds of challenges. And one thing I want to mention as well, we're not talking about the high percentage of people with disabilities that exhibit unsafe behavior or have adjustment problems or have disruptive problems as part of the behavior that they exhibit. We're talking in terms of really dangerous folks, we're talking about the single digits. So there's occasionally a belief that, well, people with intellectual disabilities, are, kind of wild and unmanageable, and that couldn't be further from the truth. But when we talk about the folks that do have these problems, first and foremost, we have to step up and say, what are we doing to ensure that the staff, the families, whomever the case, have the resources and the information and training in order to step up and put behavior procedures in place that will enable the individual to succeed. And that was kind of my goal in life for a long time, was how can I assist a person to be successful with more appropriate forms, or at least have a choice to make to more appropriate forms of getting what they needed than was going on when I arrived. A great example goes with seclusion rooms. I dealt in school settings with students who were not really highly interested in their school activities. They might be bored, they might not really like the work, whatever the case. And so they figured out pretty quickly that if they were naughty, they would end up in a closet outside of the classroom where they could just kind of hang out, and they might be a little boring, but they would get worksheets which weren't very challenging, and they would literally stay there all day. Or in many cases, we'd see schools reduce their school days. There are all kinds of, and basically they were being very successful with their inappropriate responses. And I think Edison mentioned briefly trainings like MANT. There's also Crisis Prevention Institute trainings that look at ways of de-escalating problems without having to resort to hands-on procedures. And as a therapist, my goal was to learn to understand through the use of data and other means, observation, et cetera, on ways that I could support their caregivers to assist that person with being able to make choices about what they are going to do, and ideally have those choices make sense in terms of, to make better decisions about what they are going to do next. Or in the case of really reflexive problems, the reflex doesn't occur. And the main thing to say is that at the point when a person goes into restraint, or the person goes into seclusion, or the person is ejected from the program, we failed that individual. And that person deserves services as much as anybody else who's eligible for that program. And so it's incumbent on us as a field to ensure that, number one, there's less restrictive treatment in place to make the use of seclusion and restraint less necessary or unnecessary, and do the best we can to enable that individual to be more independent. And so in terms of the therapy that I was involved in, there was more teaching. We have people with intellectual developmental disabilities that their frame of reference was fairly brief. So if we could step in and offer them better choices before problems started, we didn't have as many problems. On the other hand, as I kind of scan the state, there are not very many folks that are out there doing this work. There are quite a few psychologists at the Monroe Meyer Institute who are primarily working with children in different areas of concern, and it's still not enough. We're all the way on the eastern side of the state in Omaha. We've made attempts to ensure that we have these services available in other areas of the state, like the Panhandle and the Kearney, Hastings, Grand Island area. But in terms of a service system, DD services in the state, we are not providing adequate support to providers. And what we wind up with is that providers are turning people down because they just can't get the level of resources to bring staff in. Of course, we've got staffing shortages, and that just exacerbates things all the more. So I don't want to go on at great length, but just from the perspective, number one, I'm a parent. My son has had a history in his life of some challenging behavior. He's a young adult now, and he's actually a great guy, and I treasure him. But there were days where we had our challenges. Irrespective of that, as a professional, I'm an advocate for ensuring that resources are available. I see too many circumstances where people with disabilities wound up in very restrictive circumstances because the resources were not provided to ensure that their caregivers were able to meet their needs, in terms of their behavior or, in many cases, mental health diagnoses. One last thing that I'll mention, just from a therapy standpoint, another unfortunate area of that we deal with is psychoactive medication. Right now, at least in the last numbers that I looked at, within our intellectual and developmental disability service network across the state, approximately 40% of people take some kind of psychoactive medication. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the goal was not to be anti or pro, black and white, anything. People need to be safe. People need treatment when they have issues of concern in their lives. And I can tell you that having worked with people with process schizophrenia and other significant mental health disorders, there's just no moving forward without medication. But 40% is significantly higher than typical of citizens in Nebraska. And it makes sense in a way if you look at, if you're working with a person, if you have a child, or if you have a student who is having significant behavior concerns, and everything you've tried may not be working very well, but you may not have very many resources, who do you ask? Well, you might go to the child or individual's doctor and say, what can I do? And doctors will step up and try medication as a treatment. But like seclusion and restraint, medication typically is not treatment. It's more a matter of, at best, it gives us a window of opportunity to step in and treat in terms of real therapy. Now, in some mental health cases, it really is necessary as a part of a treatment protocol, and I would never say never. But I am concerned that we seem to very heavily medicate members of this population of people in services. And when I say 40%, I'm not talking about people that have exhibited problem behaviors. I'm talking about everybody who is receiving DD services in the state of Nebraska. That's a lot of drugs. And again, it's just a prevention. It's not a treatment. So I think, I'm certainly open to questions later, but at this point, I want to take it, that's a little bit from the, I guess, therapist perspective. Again, I did that work for a long time and worked with some really great professionals. And so I feel like I've had, a fairly valid experience in terms of supporting folks in that way. I want to turn it over at this point to Mary Angus, who's also has a background in therapy, to talk a little bit about maybe the point of view from the person's perspective who might be having behavioral difficulties and might be subjected to restraint seclusion. I'll say one last thing before I toss it to Mary, is that one of the reasons we talk about this, and Edison talked about it in terms of prone restraint. I know of cases where a 7-year-old little girl died of suffocation because she was restrained face down. And I mean, oh, for Pete's sake, I mean, what were people thinking? And also, if we go back to our own area of the country, in Omaha, a gentleman who was on the autism spectrum was at a bowling alley, had problems, was restrained by passerbys, and died of asphyxiation just this past year. So while I can talk about things from a historical perspective, it really is something that we're dealing with right up to this moment. So Mary, I'll toss it to you. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to start this out with saying that I am much more likely to have a pretty passionate perspective on the use of restraints and seclusions. I was trained for therapist. I have done therapy with abusive families. But most of my real learning has come from my life experiences. Not that I was restrained a lot. I'm not sure I would ever say that I was officially restrained, but I've been involved on the national and the local level, the regional level, with efforts to reduce and eliminate restraints. There was an effort in Nebraska called Coalition Free Nebraska years ago. It got started. The Kim Foundation was part of it. Uta Holly was part of it, but suddenly it went away, and I'm not sure if it ever got anywhere. But we did have 3 conferences, and I was struck by the lackadaisical response by professionals. We had a really good video that I haven't been able to get a hold of, and it showed restraints being done to and on people who were voluntarily doing that, as an example. And then they had kids explaining what it was like for them. Nationally and locally, and everyone that has been restrained, almost every one of them will tell you that it was like an assault. Seclusions are like being hidden away, and I had one young lady tell me that she was afraid they would never come back for her. Oftentimes, these things are done, and I know that there are situations in which I hate to say may be appropriate, but I know there are such situations, and some of them are pretty dire. But my experience with another piece of information about me, I have a severe and persistent mental illness and have been hospitalized many times. I have most of my experiences on the mental health end of that, but in terms of that, the institutions that we have in this state, the regional centers, now we're pretty much down to 1, we're actually more or less developmental disabilities and mental health, because they were both being misdiagnosed. So folks in those settings were restrained and seclusions a lot. But when we were showing the video about what it was like for the kids who had been restrained, And I have to say, I really liked Edison's use of the word subjected to, and Mark's not using the word need. All I can tell is I've heard so many times he needed to be restrained. He needed to be restrained. She's going to need to be restrained. My semantics come in here because need, if I don't do something a child needs, then I've done something wrong. And if I've just not done something that happens, if I have not restrained them, then I haven't done anything wrong. I simply have not restrained them. So again, the semantics. But in this particular situation, I sat with professionals from an institution here in Nebraska, and I'll just say it was Beatrice, who we were all asked at our tables, think about what it felt to watch that video. Talk on your table. What did it feel like to watch those folks getting, the kids, listen to kids. And the professionals at my table, instead of saying what it felt like, and actually maybe this was what it felt like, they simply said, yeah, that's the way it looks. That's the way we do it. I mean, it didn't even impact them emotionally. On the other hand, the kids sure were expressing a lot of emotional impact. I'm going to just kind of give you some thoughts on it. It's always traumatic for a person being restrained. It is unknown, you may not realize it, but it's also can be traumatic for the ones witnessing it, the ones doing it. It's not just that person who is the victim. There are lots of folks that can be the victim. Some of the things that can help afterwards, if you have a debriefing, research shows that being able to verbalize the experience doesn't get rid of it, but can reduce the impact of the restraint or the trauma. And with trauma, it lasts a long time. You would be surprised at how long someone can remember how bad that was. Someone who can experience the folks who will tell me, don't walk too close to me because I'll freak out. Because when they did that, they were always grabbing me. And this is a lifelong, this was an adult woman who had long since been not restrained. And so it was like, it stayed with her for a long, long time. In terms of what I've experienced personally, for me, it was extremely traumatic to watch someone being restrained. I also worked at the regional center, not as an employee, but doing some work there related to a lawsuit. I had a woman tell me, well, I need to be restrained. I can't control myself. And after a few months, we had discussed this, the group that we were in, and she was saying, I've been teaching my staff how to help me control myself. It was a matter of everybody thought she needed to be restrained. But in one particular situation where I watched a woman being taken down, and that phrase means that they get grabbed and thrown to the ground. This woman had gone into her room and was very nervous and wanted her anxiety medication. And they said, no, you go in and calm yourself down. Just by herself. She's supposed to go calm herself down. When she did not, she came out and was threatening to hurt herself. They called in the guards. 5 men took her down to the ground. One holding each limb and one holding her center. This woman was in the hospital for the trauma of having been gang raped. What do you think that felt like to her? I may be going a little too far into that kind of detail, but I could not speak. Now, people who know me will think, Mary couldn't speak. I was unable to speak for about 20 hours. It was so traumatic for me to see that. It was so traumatic for me to see that. And then in the situation where people go in, are placed in seclusion, it's, are they ever coming back for me? Am I going to be in here forever? And, you know, some people find it boring. Other people find it frightening, terrifying. I myself have been in situations where I was trying to get away from people. And when I ended up going into my own seclusion. And when somebody tried to pull me out, which would have been similar to restraint, I couldn't even think. It was not, I was not able to process the situation. And for adults as well as children, when those kinds of things happen to them, they cease thinking. They go directly to fight, flight, and I'm going to add annihilate. Because a lot of these kids, especially with stronger behavioral health needs, are more likely to try to just pummel their way out of it. And I've got a family member like that, and he won't remember a damn thing after it's over. Excuse my French, that's not too French, but it is amazing the impact of that trauma. And in fact, the research will show is that, especially before the age of 18, those kinds of experiences increase your likelihood of dying early. From heart attack, from diabetes, from all kinds of different cancer, your likelihood is increased of dying early. Finally, something that Mark brought up, and that is the chemical restraints. The chemical restraints can, oh yeah, they can calm someone down. As a matter of fact, some of the ones that will calm someone down that was precisely some of the early antipsychotics. The comments by the doctors that wanted to use it really actually said, oh, it's wonderful. It makes them tame like a yard animal. And we're so glad that they're calm like that. My own experience with those kinds of medications is they put a fog over the whole world. It felt like I was looking through gauze. I can't participate fully or be included in my life if I can't even process what's going on. So I'll take any questions you have at the end, or you can get hold of me afterwards. And I will say again, I'm not speaking on behalf of any organization, just myself. And so I'm going to hand it over to Brad. Or do I go back to Mark? I don't know. Thank you.
I'll jump in real quickly. Thank you, Mary. The chilling is the only word that I can take from that, but yet so real. So thank you very much. Our last presenter is Mr. Brad Mearens. Brad is the Public Policy and Legislative Director. I don't think I have that quite right, but he'll correct me. For Disability Rights Nebraska, between Brad and Edison, who spoke earlier, we have two of the most involved individuals in the state when it comes to legislation and policy around disability. And I know that this is an area that Brad has done a lot of work in and to good effect, and it's greatly appreciated. So at this point, I'll hand it over to Brad, and he can speak about what's going on in Nebraska from a data and other standpoints. Brad.
Great. Thanks, Mark. As Mark said, my name is Brad Mearens, and I am the Public Policy Director at Disability Rights Nebraska, the state's designated protection and advocacy organization for persons with disabilities. And this has been a really big issue for us and our organization. It always is high on our radar, and we're always keeping an eye out for changes, policies, legislation around the use of restraint seclusion, particularly in the school context. So I have some slides that I want to present to you today. I want to kind of give you some more data that might be on the more national aggregate level. Then I want to kind of get into the particulars about Nebraska. So I might go kind of quickly, but my presentation and all the slides are in the Dropbox, and all of the other links and other information and resources are in the Dropbox. If not, they're linked in my presentation. So you will have full access to everything that I might be talking about, even if I go kind of quickly. And if I do go too quickly for you, I'll be happy to answer any questions or go over anything in the Q&A session afterwards. So let me pull over to my slides here and start my little presentation. So I want to kind of give you a little bit of a national picture and give you some data and some statistics, and then kind of go into the Nebraska specifics. So data collection. National data from the 2017-2018 Civil Rights Data Collection, which Edison had referenced earlier, or we call it the CRDC. It gives us a rear view mirror snapshot of the issue. Because it's a survey-based collection of data, it always is it has data that's always about a year or two in arrears, because you can't have that real-time data. It's a reporting tool. So we're always kind of getting a rear view mirror snapshot of the issue. The CRDC is a survey of nearly every public school and school districts in the country. So there's about 17,604 districts, 97,000 schools. It covers 50.9 million students in the US. And of those 50.9 million students that are covered under the CRDC data collection, around 16% of them are students with disabilities. 13% of those 16 are students that are served under the IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And about 3% of that 16 are students that are served under Section 504. So in 2009, 2010, the US Department of Education started collecting data on the physical and mechanical restraints of students, and seclusion as well. Here are the definitions that they used in their data collection: physical restraint, mechanical restraint, and seclusion. And those are the three particular areas that the CRDC is focused on. Now, there's a fourth sort of category of restraint that we talk about in the literature, and that's called chemical restraint. And that is the dispensing or application of medicine or some sort of drug to calm behavior. But they don't necessarily look at that particular type of restraint in the CRDC. So we're going to focus on these three types. So the 2017-2018 data, which is the most recent, indicates that there were over 101,000 incidences of restraint and seclusion. Well, number of students that were subjected to restraint and seclusion numbers in over 100,000. 70,000 of those students were subjected to physical restraint. That is a physical hold of someone. A little under 4,000 students were subjected to mechanical restraint. And remember, that's where you have a device or a mechanism that is used to restrain the student. And around a little under 30,000 students, or 27,000 plus students, were subjected to seclusion in 2017, 2018. Now, these are also self-reported data from schools. The data indicates that students with disabilities are disproportionately subjected to restraint and seclusion. So the 2017-18 data indicates that students with disabilities comprise about 13%. That's the students under the IDEA. They're around 13% of the enrollment total, but they're 80% of those students that are subjected to physical restraint. That 13% is 41% of the incidences of mechanical restraint, and 77% of the incidences of seclusion. So while it may be a small portion of students make up a small portion of the total enrollment, they are the overwhelming target and subject of restraint and or seclusion. And I should also mention, this data is very similar to what was reported in the previous CRDC and the one before that. it hovers around 78 to 80% consistently. This slide and the next one, I'm not really going to go over, but these are some little vignettes that come out of the National Disability Rights Network's report of 2009, the Government Accountability's report in 2009, and the 2014 Senate hearing report. They all describe incidences where the use of restraint and or seclusion has resulted in significant injury and or death to students across the country. I don't want to focus and dwell on this in particular, but I wanted to raise this and the next slide to you so you have some idea and some semblance of the gravity of the issue that we're addressing here today. So, having gotten the national level, the 30,000 foot level stuff out of the way, let's focus on Nebraska. So, there is no federal law that regulates the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. The IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is silent on the use of restraint and seclusion. Not a word. There have been previous, and there's a current attempt at federal legislation, but nothing has passed. That is the Keeping All Students Safe Act, or CASA. It was introduced in 2017, 2018. You have a link to both the House version and the Senate version. And then it was reintroduced again in 21-22. Again, linked to the House version and the Senate version. And I think overall, this is a pretty good bill. I think it has a lot of protections that are missing in it. It may not be the end all be all one ideal solution wrapped up with a bow, but it certainly goes a lot longer, a lot further to protect students with disabilities from the zero that they have now. And I also kind of wanted to highlight this NPR piece that I found that talks about the Office of Civil Rights requires that school districts report every time a student is restrained. However, they're self-reported. And a lot of advocates and the GAO itself produced a report in 2000, I think it was 2011 or 2012. I could be wrong on that date, but they produced a report that said 70% of the data is inaccurate because there's a whole bunch of zeros. But we know that the practice of restraint and seclusion is much more rampant than the long laundry list of zeros across the country that gets self-reported into the CRDC. So as a result, states are left to regulate restraint and seclusion in their school systems, which means that there's a wide variety of language, wide variety of protections, wide variety of varying, dizzying spirals of protections and language in every state. There is some language that's in legislation in some states. There's some states regulated by regulation, some states regulated by policy action. Again, there's a wide and dizzying array of language and prescriptions in all the different states. There's different standards, there's different definitions, there's different criteria, etc. So we truly have a patchwork of regulation, legislation, and policy to regulate this uniform practice across the country. And Nebraska is no exception. So, looking at the Office of Civil Rights, that's the OCR for the US Department of Education, they have these national estimates that they've produced from the CRDC and the data that they have collected. And I looked at those for Nebraska, and here's what I found. Of the 749 public school students who were subjected to seclusion in Nebraska in 2017-18, almost 76% were students with disabilities. And those students that were subjected to physical restraint in Nebraska were over 80% students with disabilities, while 15.1% of the students are served under the IDEA. And like I said earlier, the GAO produced a study in, 2020. That was way off. it raises questions about the fidelity of schools' self-reporting. They indicate that about 70% of districts across the country reported 0 incidents of restraint and seclusion. And they indicated that the Department of Education's quality check only applies to fewer than 100 of the large districts. It doesn't go down to those medium and smaller level districts. So there is some question about the quality of the reporting data, which means that it is highly likely that those numbers, even in the CRDC, are underreported and undercounted. But I would like to also say that in Nebraska, we have attempted to rectify the situation a little. So in 2021, Senator Wayne had introduced Legislative Bill 154, which would require the Department of Education here in Nebraska to collect data and on incidences of the use of restraint and seclusion, and to cross or to kind of break that down by disability as well. So we're happy to see that. So Nebraska's only regulation of the use of restraint and seclusion is found in Rule 10, which is Nebraska's regulation to accredit schools here in Nebraska. So you have here 011.01E, that's the actual language in Rule 10. And it says that each school system will have a policy, a restraint and seclusion policy that's approved by their school board or their local governing body. But that's it. It doesn't indicate what should be in those policies. It doesn't indicate anything about when you should be doing restraint, what that should look like. It has no prescriptions. It just says you have to have one. And as a result, there is little to no uniformity in schools' policies. District policies really do differ for students by their zip code. Westside High School in Omaha's policy is different than the North Platte School policy, which is different than the Lincoln Public Schools, which is different than OPS, which is different than Barnett. There is some similarity in maybe the definition of restraint, or there is a few discrepancies within language, but the policies on the whole are very widely from school to school, from district to district. Oh, and by the way, just to give you a heads up, there has been an attempt to rewrite Rules 10 and Rule 10 and Rule 14 to rewrite those rules. And in the first iteration that came out early, it was about mid last year, the Rule 10 language about the restraint and seclusion policy above here, 011.01E, did not make it into the rewrite. As a result, or not as a result, but they've now postponed the development of this rewrite to allow for, like I said here, additional stakeholder and practitioner engagement. Hint, hint. So you might want to keep an eye out for that, and especially keep an eye out for what language does and does not make it into the rewrite. And remember, hint, hint, they are postponing the rewrite to get input from stakeholders. Guess what? That's you. That's me. That's us. So keep your eye out for that. Here's a copy of what we do have to help schools in their creation and development of these policies. In 2010, the Nebraska Department of Education commissioned a study. There's a picture of it here on the right. It's a guidance document to help districts develop their restraint and seclusion policies. In fact, it has two different templates in this document. One is a more detailed template, which goes into more specific details about parental notification, timing of the incidents, how often does a staff have to look in on a student who's being secluded, that level of detail. It also provides a more generic template that's more general in nature and general in its language. However, the catch is that that's all this is. It's just guidance. There's no requirement that schools have to take one word out of this document, which, by the way, is almost now 12 years old. So this is what students and families have to hang their hat on in terms of protection for their students and the appropriate use of restraint and or seclusion techniques is this guidance document, 12 years old. And I'm not saying that the 12 years old is a bad thing. This document's actually very good. It was produced by one of the leading national experts on this topic, Dr. Reese Peterson, formerly of UNL. He is retired now, but he was the national expert, was instrumental in putting this together. So I really think this is a really good document. It has some really good language in it. So I have given you here, and I don't necessarily want to go through these detail by detail, but I've given you some examples of what I'm talking about. So for example, the Banner County Public School, this is an excerpt from their policy on restraint and seclusion. You'll notice that they have property as a circumstance by which restraint or seclusion would be an appropriate response. They talk about how it would be appropriate to teach a skill or to calm a student. They talk about how it could be used to break up a fight, which, by the way, is the language that the proponents of the legislation that's been introduced over the last 6 or 7 years talk about, how like we need to have this policy or this legislation to break up a fight or to break up, assault on a teacher. Our argument has been that these policies that are already created in schools would account for that, because the policies that are written are intended not to be specifically targeted at students with disabilities. They're generic in their language, but their application is definitely targeted towards students with disabilities. This one also allows for mechanical restraint. You'll note, and it also talks about mechanical restraint as being an assistive technology device. You'll notice that that's something different. In the Omaha public schools, there's no discussion of mechanical restraint. It talks about an imminent danger of physical harm. It says that destruction of or damage of property is not permissible. Unlike Banner, or unlike the previous one, Banner, yeah, Bruce Banner, says that property would be an appropriate response or appropriate circumstance for the use of restraint and seclusion. This one talks about 24 hours. You've got to notify the parents and the student, and you have to. This one also, OPS's language also includes those students who may be nonverbal or who have to communicate by their hands. Banner's does not. Millard's is different than those two. Talks about significant imminent risk of injury, and that the student can demonstrate the intent and the ability to cause that significant imminent injury. This language also includes language that talks about how it's a last resort after other methods have failed, right? Mechanical and chemical restraints are not authorized in Millard, but they are, mechanical, at least in Banner. And this one says prone restraint is not authorized. None of the other ones. So again, I wanted to bring these out to you to show that the policies by district can vary wildly. And the last one I wanted to bring up to you is this one. Bellevue's policy is literally this. It's 3 paragraphs, and there's very little prescription about what constitutes restraint, what's a seclusion, and what the criteria for the use or non-use and de-escalation and all those other things. Prone restraint, mechanical restraint aren't included in Bellevue. So again, my point is that the lack of federal legislation and the lack of a prescriptive regulation here in Nebraska allows for different policies and for different schools, which means that our students' protections against the use of inappropriate restraint and seclusion literally varies by what your zip code is. Lastly, UNL did a study in 2019 and looked at 85 local school district policies on restraint and seclusion in Nebraska. And here's what they found. That a lot of them didn't have the imminent danger of serious physical harm. 91% of their sample didn't have that, or it included contradictory language. It also found out that 28% of the district policies did not include anything of documenting the incident. 87% didn't have anything about debriefing, and 23% didn't include the reporting incidents to guardians when a restraint was used. So again, differing policies, differing standards, differing language, not uniform. And lastly, here's my contact information. if you have any questions or want more information, check the Dropbox. I brought in a bunch of my research and my resources and dropped them in the Dropbox. If that's not sufficient for you, please let me know. Send me an email, give me a phone call, send a carrier pigeon, whatever. I'll be happy to help you find out whatever you're looking for and help you, answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I know I kind of went kind of fast, but I'm going to turn it back over to Mark for any further questions and answers.
Thank you, Brad. That was a lot of information, but I hope folks were watching the chat because there's lots of links. And of course, this is being recorded, so it'll be available to you through, I believe, the Silk website. So,
well, you know my motto, Mark. My motto is, at least you can't say you left underinformed.
What can I say? I won't even touch that one. At this point in time, we've got about 10 minutes. We wanted to give folks a chance to, there hasn't been a lot in the Q&A, but there have been a few things in the chat. We've tried to respond to those, but if we can unmute folks, we would certainly be open to having questions for our presenters today. With that much information, I would suspect there might be a few questions out there, but we did want to set time aside for you. So, and can folks unmute themselves, guys?
Be able to.
So, questions for our panelists. I'm not going to do the going, gone thing. We'll give it a minute. And you can certainly type questions into the chat or into the Q&A if there are some questions coming up.
While we're waiting for questions, I just wanted to say, this year, obviously there is a new bill. We're hoping that we'll be able to hold it off again this year, but it's going to be a short and very vigorous session. The hearing should be towards the end of session on the new bill, and we're hoping that Senator Groney will instead prioritize his bill to focus on his meat packing bill to go and get meat packers incentives. But yeah. And Jane asked, what about the NSEA, Nebraska State Education Association? What stance did they take on the bills? I haven't seen their bill come out or their bill positions come out. I'm assuming though they're supporting, and we will be having some conversations with them soon. And somebody noted that Groney is term limited after this session. So I think that's going to change some of the dynamics around this conversation.
Another question we have so if I understand correctly, the ADA only covers a bare minimum within the schools. I'm presuming within, respect to seclusion and restraint. Brad, you want to catch that one? You're muted, Brad.
Sure. The IDE, the Individual School Education Act, is my understanding is that's the legislation that really kind of controls the educational, components and curriculum within the schools, and that would be the one that would be the most pertinent to include something around discipline and restraint and seclusion, but it doesn't say anything about, thou shalt not use restraints, for de-escalation techniques have been initiated. It doesn't have anything about that. If you want, I have a really good law review that talks about how the IDEA is the mechanism for restraint and seclusion, and how it does not address that particular issue. I'd be happy to find it and send it to you, or I can try to find it before we end here.
Okay, and another
Mary, I'd
question.
like to answer Mike Tufte's if I may.
Go ahead, Mayor.
Okay, Mike, the bills that have come out, including the one that just was proposed a couple weeks ago, indicate that there would be no administrative discipline or consequences of the use of restraint in which there were injuries unless they were really working outside of their policy. So if they were doing that, obviously to hurt somebody, they could be administratively disciplined. The same is indicated in there about the civil liabilities. Now, one of the things that I don't really understand, and Senator Lathrop has talked a lot about, there are some liability legislation. There is some that would cover keeping them safe against different legal actions, but that would be something for someone else to talk about. Thanks for asking that, Mike. And Fred Robinson is saying, were you going to answer this one, Mark?
So
The
we have a
open one?
question, LB 1179, that is a follow-up to Groney's proposal last year, and I should watch to see position NSEA takes on this question. Last year, I did contact NSEA opposing the position they took, since I am an NSEA retired member. Brad would like to respond to this question.
Yeah, that's the bill you should be watching. I would also suggest that there's another bill by Senator Day, I forget the number, but it also talks about establishing behavioral health point of contact staff members in schools. That's important because Legislative Bill 1179, which is the main vehicle for this issue in the legislature, has basically three major components. The first component is the behavioral health point of contact establishment, the staff that will be the point of contact, and basically have a list of community resources for behavioral health, help students kind of coordinate and get hooked up with mental health treatment and services in the community. That's the first part. That's also Senator Day's bill. It's 800 something.
852.
It's 852.
Thank you. But Senator Groney's 1179 takes that point of contact language, adds the restraint and student discipline language, and then talks also about creating a system by which they can take students out of class, which we think has some conflicts with the established IDEA regulations and standards for removal of students with disabilities from the classroom. So yes, I would say you want to watch two bills, 852 and 1179. But if you're interested in the restraint and this particular issue, 1179 is the bill you want to watch. Yes, it is the same bill as or basically almost the same language that's been introduced in previous sessions. So yes.
Very good.
And I put a link in the chat to the actual web page on the unicameral website, which is the web page for 1179, the bill. So you can get a copy of the bill there, and you can watch and see, when it gets its hearing, what its history is, what's going to happen with it. So check out that link as well.
A follow-up question, Brad,
yeah,
is,
go ahead.
Go ahead. A follow-up question was, do either of the bills include any specifics for staff training?
Yes. I do believe 1179 talks about staff training. For example, it says that administrators, teachers, counselors, nurses are going to be required to have a behavioral health awareness training every 3 years. And that if the school wants to provide a similar training or the same training or one that's similar to all the other employees, coaches, paras, custodial staff, they have that option if they want to. So yeah, it does call for some behavioral awareness training. I'm not exactly sure. I have to go back and look to be specific about whether it talks about, well, actually it does. The training would include de-escalation techniques and other sort of factors. So yes, they do get that training.
May I?
Follow-up question then is regarding safety, but is there training to teach safe techniques in the bills?
Such as how do you restrain someone physically without harming them?
Yes.
On this, Mary, I'm looking at what I looked at analyzing the bill. First off, the training has some specific things included in it for the teacher training. However, there is also they can actually go forward with bus drivers and everybody they can think of if they want to provide training for them. And this restraint could happen on any location where there is a school function going on. So the Little League, deal. But the training for those other folks is very general. It just says reasonable training. And the fact of the matter is that there is a very high turnover, a turnover in bus drivers, just as an example. Like a lot of them don't even last a year. So the training couldn't be kept up. How could you possibly keep everybody trained? So that's one of my comments on that.
Yeah. So, and I'm sorry, I have not had a ton of time to really dig through 1179, and I have seen so many different drafts of this bill and amendments that sometimes I have to be careful my brain doesn't just blur them together. So I'm looking back at this, and 1179 does include that training, and it does lay out some requirements for that training, including recognition of detrimental factors impacting student behavior, including but not limited to signs of trauma, positive behavior support and proactive teaching strategies, including but not limited to expectations and boundaries, verbal intervention and de-escalation techniques, information on the duties, parental and student rights and responsibilities outlined in the Student Discipline Act and case law addressing student behavior related to the classroom, extracurricular activities, school transportation, and other time on school property, and instruction on classroom safety interventions pursuant to Section 4 of this Act on classroom safety removals, pursuant to Section 5 of this Act, and on the school district's policies under such sections. The thing is, they want to make sure, and with this, you always have to keep in mind who's in the lobby significantly impacts this, which is why I'm always like, hey, come down to the lobby, hang out with me, because the more people we have there, the better, the louder our voices are going to be. And what really happens is we end up hearing, especially from the administrators, and from the school board association, that both want to make sure that they have the flexibility to make those determinations themselves, keep their flexibility within their own district and local control, which is a big concept in the legislature. And they want flexibility as to what program it is, and that allows a lot of flexibility as to, Mark and I talked a little bit about the types of programs earlier, and you'll have variety about what those programs are.
Yeah, I think in terms of
running into the end, I just wanted to let people know, I put into the chat box the language, all schools employment employees shall have a basic awareness. And my concern about is it FERPA? I don't think the bus driver, the janitor, most of the staff should know whether I've got health concerns, whether I've got a mental health. I don't think that kind of information should be in the hands of just everybody, so they can make that determination on whether it's appropriate to restrain that. Sorry, Brad, thanks.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, the bill does not specifically talk about you should have training on how to safely restrain or seclude students. It does have language like Edison was talking about, but it does say that it should include, but not be limited to, and then the list that Edison was talking about. So I think part of the answer to your question is no, it doesn't talk about specifically thou shalt get training on how to safely do restraints. It does talk about behavioral health awareness training, and it says it's included but not limited to. So there could be some incorporation of those sort of specific techniques if the school wanted to do that.
It's section 5, Brad. That's where it says instruction on classroom safety interventions pursuant to section 4 of this act. So that's what they mean when they say that. It's not necessarily the clearest though.
Okay. I know that there's a lot of interest. But we're past our time, and we don't want to hold people over and hold our presenters over. I want to thank all our presenters for their detailed and informative presentations. I want to thank all of our all of the attendees for your interest. And again, next month we'll be looking at another topic, and we'll have, hopefully, an equally informative and compelling set of information. We're dedicated, we in the Disability Education Series are dedicated to ensuring that information, which is so critical in disability services, is available and out there for anybody and all who need it. So again, thank you all. Do you have any last comments, Don?
Just that next month, March 3rd, is going to be dignity of risk. That's what the topic will be. And if you know what that is, great. If you don't know what it is, either look it up or come to this series, because you will learn a lot. It is very important to know what dignity of risk is around the disability community. And once again, just thank you to the presenters, the interpreters, and to the captioner. I mean, we can't do any of this without any of you, so thank you.
Okay, thanks all, and hope you have a great rest of your day. And I'm sure that any of our presenters would be open to being contacted, as I would, if you have further interest, questions, or concerns. Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, guys.